What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing shadow people, and this is video number 4 for this channel. My research is really extensive, so again, without being repetitive, let's just jump right in. I've covered shadow entities extensively on this channel, and I am currently starting to write my 3rd book, which is all about these elusive beings right now. Of all the theories that I've come across, there is one that a year ago I would have told you was the most outlandish and maybe impossible, but today, after having had many more experiences and also having become more involved in the community of ufology, and that's the explanation that shadow people could in fact be extraterrestrials. I'm not saying by any means that this is the only possible explanation for shadow entities, and I have other possibilities in this video as well. But the more I've come to learn and the more research I come across, the more convinced I become that there could be something to this. Take, for example, my own experiences with shadow people. Not my random and kind of average, everyday peripheral vision, here one moment and gone the next type of shadow encounters, but the one I spoke to you guys about at length in my video discussing the quote-unquote family of shadow people I've been dealing with almost my entire life. I never knew that that's not normal, and by that I mean in the realm of encounters and or experiences with shadow entities, for these beings to have telepathic communications with the people they're in the same room with. For the people like myself who encounter what they feel are the same shadow entities over and over and over again. The more I looked into these communications with these 3 specific entities, the more I started to learn that many people have, in fact, had the same type of telepathic exchange with shadow people, and many of them attribute this to the fact that they could have actually been encountering aliens. Are you following me so far? You might want to go back and watch my lifelong experiences with a family of shadow people and then maybe come back, because that's the video I'm referring to and that I do refer to multiple times in this video. When I started uncovering randomly some repressed memories of my own contact with ETs about 6 months ago, it all started to come together and make sense. I just want to say right from the door that I think much more thought and research should be put into the theory that shadow people could also possibly be time travelers from the past or future, and several other almost limitless possibilities. For the purposes of this video though, I want to take a deeper dive into why and or how shadow people could actually be extraterrestrials who, for one reason or another, have to appear as these sometimes terrifying shadow beings instead of in their own natural form. And then, like I said, towards the end, I'll review a couple other theories. The first thing that comes to my mind is energy, right? I talk about energy a lot, and it's usually the first frame of reference my mind goes to when dealing with any outside or non-human entity I or others like me encounter almost daily or even every once in a while. Let's face it, most people who have had one encounter with such entities end up searching for more answers, because as human beings, I feel it's like near impossible for us to just reconcile ourselves to the fact that something like this is happening, these interactions and exchanges, and we still know almost nothing, and everything we think we know is really just mere theory and speculation at this point. As I've mentioned in previous videos, shadow entities of one kind or another have been around since the beginning of time. More and more people lately, or so it seems, have been either encountering them more often, or it's just that now they're more willing and able to come forward with their experiences. I think it's a little bit of both. Up until very recently, these entities have fit very nicely into the little tidy box labeled apparitions, ghosts, and or spirits. Sometimes, and I'm working on a full video about this as well, we see them labeled as time travelers. However, to get to the heart of the video, more and more now as I research, I'm seeing them pop up in the world of extraterrestrials and alien abductions. Most of the time, shadow entities are seen just in our periffs, just like a quick glimpse, which makes it very easy for our minds to dismiss them as imagination. Did I really just see that? That type stuff. Other times, though, the more familiar accounts, people will claim that they did in fact see the entity head on, and sometimes it even runs into them and then disappears, but they actually physically feel the impact from the shadow person, or it's choking them. Physical violence inflicted by some of these entities is not limited to only sleep paralysis, not by a long shot, and that's another reason why my research into shadow entities is so incredibly extensive, seemingly never-ending, and full of rabbit holes. Lucky for all of us, that's just how I like it. So let's get down to it. A lot of people who have been abducted by extraterrestrials report first seeing shadow entities out of the corner of their eyes, the periph. Some bring the theory that these are perhaps extraterrestrials who are in fact invisible to the human eye. Yes, we still see them as this kind of shadow thing, but that's because even something invisible has to have mass, right? Could it be, too, that these sightings of the shadows are alien beings in some kind of altered state? Why they take these forms on will most likely never be known to us, but I mean, all of this is very possible. Let's examine a case for a few minutes and see what happens afterwards. The case of Kelly Cahill and what happened to her and her family back in 1993 while driving home from a friend's house. It was 27-year-old Kelly, her husband, and their 3 children. This takes place in the Dandenong foothills, which is near Belgrave, Victoria, Australia. This place has become known as the location for one of the most unusual sightings of a strange extraterrestrial creature one could find while reviewing the case files for people who have dealt with such things. To put it simply, abduction case files. Anyways, back to Kelly and her family. August 8th, 1993, in the very early morning hours, everyone in the family car noticed a round craft with lights and windows all around the sides of it. The bright lights are mainly what caught the family's attention. As it hovered above the road, the lights, which were several different colors and sort of looking like a rainbow, were visible from the bottom of the craft. This UFO was so close to the ground that Kelly later on would say that she could have sworn that she had seen figures in the windows which were surrounding the ship. Kelly actually said, quote, seeing people, end quote, through the window openings. She started to scream to her husband about what she was seeing, and the second she did so, the craft took off at inhuman speeds and went to the left and then zoomed completely out of their sight and off into the distance somewhere. Throughout all of this, the family continued their drive. The vehicle hadn't stopped at all, but now they were all very much interested in what was going on in the sky above. All of a sudden, they came upon a light that was so bright it nearly blinded them. Kelly had to shield her eyes as if from the bright sun on a hot day. She asked her husband, quote, "What are you going to do?" end quote. He replied, quote, "I'm going to keep on driving," end quote. He was, admittedly, just as terrified as she and their 3 children were at this point. Again, within a split second, the light seemed to just blink out, and again it seemed as though the sky were empty and all was as it should have been. Kelly started to relax just a little and couldn't wait, obviously, to just get herself and her family home safely without any more of these bizarre crafts, lights, and encounters. She may have relaxed too much because suddenly Kelly was opening her eyes and asking her husband, quote, "What happened? Did I black out?" end quote. Her husband just stared at her silently and continued to drive the family home. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Once they arrived home, Kelly smelled a very strong odor of vomit, and she felt as though something wasn't right, like something was just off. It only took her a moment or so to realize that there was something missing from their ride home. It turns out a whole hour of time. An hour of time was completely missing from their ride home. So an hour had passed as though it were a second, and nobody had any memory of what happened during the lost hour. As Kelly and her husband tried to wrap their heads around what had happened earlier in the night, they also tried to keep things in the home as normal as possible for the sake of their children. None of this says, like, if the children even witnessed any of this, if they were passed out. Like, this doesn't involve the children at all, which I find kind of lacking. Like, I think that there should be something in, but I couldn't find any source material about the kids. So they must have not been too affected because they were able to put them to sleep right when they got home. They tucked the kids into bed and went to their own room to retire for the night. As Kelly undressed to change into her pajamas, though, she noticed a strange triangle mark on her navel that had definitely not been there ever before. Obviously, she knew her own body well enough to know that this was something brand new. Immediately, she put together that this must have happened during the hour of missing time she and her family had experienced just a few short hours ago, and which they were desperately trying to forget at this point. But she couldn't help but wonder, nervously, who had put this mark there? How? Why? And most importantly, perhaps, what in the world was it? What did it mean? For the next 2 weeks, Kelly suffered from general malaise. This is the lack of energy and extremely uncomfortable and lethargic feeling that seems to come up and on out of nowhere. It's said to be caused by 3 things: fear, stress, and/or inadequate sleep. All of which I'm sure at least she and her husband both were feeling since what had happened to them on that trip home that night. I'm not sure Kelly or her family really put it together that this feeling was coming from what happened on that trip. But anyways, after 2 weeks of feeling drained of energy, she also started having other symptoms. She had to be taken to the hospital twice in those 2 weeks, once for a urinary tract infection and the other for severe stomach pain and cramping. It wasn't long before Kelly's memory of the lost time in the car started to come to her. Quite miraculously, she didn't even need any outside help like hypnosis or regression. She remembered the craft and the first time she had seen it and realized it wasn't when she had initially thought it had come into her view. She had actually seen it hovering in a nearby gully to where they were driving along the road. She estimated the size of the UFO and it was pretty big, approximately 150 feet in diameter. That's huge, that's massive. The next thing she remembered after initially spotting this thing in the gully was that she and her husband had actually pulled the car over and, without any kind of fear at all, got out and walked towards the craft. She felt as though they must have been somehow being subconsciously pulled towards the massive craft. They noticed another car pulled over alongside of the road behind them as well as they walked. This is when they first saw the creature, and it was literally out of this world and unlike anything they had ever seen before or since. It was described as being quote-unquote black, but here is where we get back to these shadow entities and the possibility that at least some of them are extraterrestrials. It was black as if it had no color, as if wherever it stood, all matter was then removed from that presence. Kelly later described it as, quote, not having a soul, end quote. Kelly described the entity as being, quote, devoid of color, end quote, yet they could very clearly make out its shape. According to Kelly, the creature's eyes looked like a fly if you were to look at one up close, really, really gigantic and glowing red. It was also a bit taller than the average man, about 7 feet tall, give or take an inch or two. As she and her husband stared into this field, she saw more creatures just like the ones she had been mesmerized by at first. She said there were suddenly, quote, heaps of them, end quote. They were all congregated outside of the craft directly beneath it. They weren't all clustered together either. There were several smaller groups of them, and one of these little clusters of entities glided about 100 yards in just a couple of seconds towards Kelly and her husband. There was another group of them gliding towards the other car she had noticed earlier as it sat motionless there on the side of the road. Where were its occupants? Kelly had a deep sense of fear and dread. She said somehow she just knew and could feel that these entities were evil, and she started screaming at them to leave her and her family alone. She clung to her husband as tightly as she possibly could, all the while trying not to black out. It didn't work, and the next thing she remembered was she was blacking out and waking up back in her car. So, this is insane, right? Well, as it turns out, those other occupants from the other car would come forward and tell a very similar story to Kelly's. Kelly started to have dreams where she would remember parts of the abduction, and here's where it gets really kind of scary. She dreamt that one of those horrible and hideous evil creatures was standing over her nude and helpless body, kissing her navel, kissing her right where that mark was left. These entities seem to be kind of intruding in our dimension. They seem to be taking up space, but not really, as it seemed as though they were only occupying places and spaces where they definitely didn't belong. Does this have to do with their vibration? As far as the creatures, it's so strange that the eyes, legs, and arms were easily distinguishable, and yet they seem to have no solid form, like they were made up of smoke or something similar, only not. Were these strange and terrifying entities time travelers? Were they extraterrestrials? Were they demons? All of the above, or something else altogether? Despite being examined by many researchers and despite the tons of theories that have been put forth about Kelly and her husband's abduction, there's nothing to prove or disprove her claims, and no solid evidence has ever been put forth one way or another. That's usually the case though, isn't it? Somehow though, as with most of the cases of people seemingly being abducted by quote-unquote shadow people, there always seems to be a connection to the Greys. This is definitely the case, at least according to what I've learned through much of my research in the Cahill abduction. Let's move on to discussing the fact that so much of the time, especially in recent years, like the last 20 or so, give or take, more and more abductees are mentioning that they remember much more of the encounter than the mere second or two most people are usually able to recall without professional help. Also, the glowing eyes thing. Mainly red, but sometimes yellow, and now more recently green too. This is reminiscent of encounters I have come across where people claim to have been abducted by the reptilians. The glowing eyes, particularly red, is widely reported in abduction with these entities specifically. Are people being put into an altered state during the abductions and because of this are only seeming to see or thinking they're seeing shadow entities? What I mean is, could it be that appearing as a shadow like this is to protect the entity's real identity? More and more people, if you really think about it, are coming forward and boldly speaking of and discussing their own abductions. So maybe the extraterrestrials use this sort of shadow person cloaking device to confuse the victim so they have less to talk about and report when coming forward with their ordeal. I mentioned in another one of my videos on shadow people something I keep coming across in all of my source material and research documents for this video, so I'm going to say it again. There are ancient myths and legends that date back to ancient times, all over the world, from ancient Greece to the Romans, and also to what we now know as modern-day Europe, the ancient Egyptians, that talk about the reptilian humanoids and their need for human blood in order to be reborn. That's a quote. Quote, their need for human blood in order to be reborn, end quote. Reptilians are said to need human blood in order to maintain that form. Definitely a lot to think about there, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Now, let's move on to whether shadow people could perhaps be from an alternate dimension. The existence of alternate realms, worlds, and dimensions isn't just the stuff of science fiction anymore. Let's face it, at least not in this community. I mean, it's pretty much a fact that they exist now, and I always wondered how shadow people play into that. Let's take a look. Is it possible that the entities that live in these alternate dimensions can sometimes become intertwined with our reality? I refer to them as entities because we don't know anything really, and I'm not 100% sure they're human. How could I be? How could anyone be? I don't know what they are, and honestly, there are an infinite amount of dimensions and realms, and any one of them could be exactly like ours, almost, or they could be completely different, and the entities living there could be far from human, like extraterrestrial, as we just spoke about kind of at length. So, with this in mind, hear me out. Is it possible that, with their ability to either accidentally or on purpose become intertwined with our reality, could it be that they see shadow entities over on their side, and this is just us being completely unaware that we are doing it, and the only way we can be seen over there, for whatever reason, is this shadow? Now, this is one of the more benign explanations for shadow people, but it shouldn't be dismissed. There are so many different types of shadow entities, and I've already discussed them at great length, as I said in my other 3 or 4 videos about shadow people. Of course, this won't be the case for the one who abduct and attack us, but it is very possible that this is the explanation for the lurkers, observers, and the travelers, as I have come to label the more benign types of shadow entities. Could it also be that these alternate dimensions have human beings and alternate versions of ourselves, and this is the reason why we are appearing, or they are appearing, as shadows? It's entirely speculation at this point, but it's definitely worth discussing, at least in my opinion. What would happen if we ourselves or they appeared in their human form to us? Would that explain the doppelganger phenomenon? Could it possibly be an alternate explanation for deja vu? We'll get to all of that in another video. Let's keep focused on the shadows for now. One type of encounter that seems to fit quite nicely with the alternate dimension theory are the ones where people see the shadow being seeming to flicker in and out of sight. Kind of like when a light bulb is loose, right? It flickers on and off until you tighten it. Could it be that these beings are human like us and accidentally crossing over into our own dimension or reality? I won't get too deep into this because I'm not even going to pretend that I understand the research, but in quantum physics, we see how even the tiniest of particles exist as quote-unquote vibrations whose frequency is coming closer and closer. For me, this is exactly what's happening with the flickering encounters. I can't yet explain what or who these things are, but I really believe in everything being and having its and their own energy. So to me, this makes perfect sense. Could this explain this coming closer and closer of the particles or matter, the abundance of recent sightings more than ever before of not only shadow entities, but of extraterrestrials and even ghosts and spirits? The gap is closing, if you will, the veil thinning between worlds, realms, and dimensions. If not traveling from another dimension, then could it be these entities are traveling from another time? I like to think of it as a type of or akin to astral projection, where the actual form of the entity or traveler crossing into our realm while their spirit or essence or even their energy remains back where they are coming from. We know for a fact time travel is possible, and if there are worlds and dimensions where they are more tech advanced than us, then how do we know they haven't found a way to move through time yet? We don't, and that's the problem. There are so many unknowns, I could talk myself in circles for hours, and believe me, sometimes while researching, that's exactly what I do. It's very frustrating. Of course, we can't forget to dive into ghosts and demons and other haunted phenomena now, can we? No way, man, not on my watch. I feel it's only natural that when thinking about or discussing shadow beings, most of us immediately consider them to be some kind of apparition from a different world. As I said earlier, this is a very convenient and neat little bowed box that they could fit in. In most cultures and legends, dark entities, not limited to shadow beings, always coincide with and sometimes even represent death and darkness. I mean, how could they not, right? If we are simply speaking of straight up ghosts though, then I would have to say, and I am an outsider as I see them differently than most, but I'm pretty sure most people see what they call ghosts as looking a bit misty and light and sometimes even like someone they knew who had passed on. So as far as ghosts, I'm not really sure what shadow entities are. I really don't know how they fit. I don't think they do. We know that ghosts and spirits were once human, and we also know that more than a few, like the majority of people who have had an encounter with shadow beings, have all said that they had the distinct feeling that the entity, quote, was not human, end quote. There was also a strange sense of inner knowing that it had never been human. There was always that sense of overwhelming dread, fear, and even depression that were reported across the board when it comes to these elusive figures. When many of us hear about glowing red eyes and a creature that isn't now and never has been human, if you know something about it that is, we think of demons. Or at least I know I do, and many victims of the encounters with these entities do as well. Even if you don't believe in any of the religious texts that mention demons or demonic forces, I always like to think we should approach all things like religious texts and even fairy tales and folklore like this. It all had to have come from somewhere, and at the very least we should, hopefully, be able to see that there's at least a snippet or some version of the truth in all of it, however small or minuscule it may be, before being changed into something to serve humanity's purpose. According to author and researcher Jerry Gross, shadow entities are, quote, the essence, end quote, of an actual person or human being who is an astral projection. To me, in my humble opinion, that's a very bold statement to make, because that's taking them being humans as an absolute fact, and as we all know, there's not much fact we can base any of this on. And all of it is basically hypothesizing and searching for answers we have come to accept, at least most of us have, that we may never actually get. Another interesting theory in the same vein as what Mr. Gross theorized is that the essence he speaks of could very well be the soul of a person who isn't alive anymore. But then why would these particular souls appear like this, and what would they be wanting? I'm not sure, and that's a rabbit hole I'm not prepared to go down, at least not right this minute, but I will get back to it in a future date and time in another video. So there are several things to consider here, just peripheral things that I'll come back to another time. How can some shadow entities appear to be solid 1 minute and walk through walls or disappear into thin air in the next? How is it that some people have had encounters with a shadow being they knew for a fact was in the shape of a man, and yet there were no other distinguishable features? How are they three-dimensional shadows? Like, what a concept, three-dimensional shadows. A lot of the time, these entities are described as black, but then when pressed further or given more time to actually stop and think about it, that assessment is changed, and the witness or victim will come forward and say that they were actually not black, but only seeming to be, as they were completely devoid of color or blacker than black. This leads me again to the term, quote unquote, soulless. I have so much more I want to discuss and go over with you guys today, but it'll have to wait for part 5, which I will definitely get started on right away. And don't forget, I'm writing my 3rd book on shadow entities and everything about them, including the sleep paralysis demon. So with a book coming out especially, my research is extensive, and I absolutely cannot wait to present it to all of you guys and see what you all think. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up. Let me know what you think in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already, and spread the love by sharing this video. Please go on over to MoonBearOracle, my new channel, where I am reading intuitive oracle once a month for each astrological sign, starting again in April. I'm also covering a lot of other stuff over there with crystals and herbs and candle magic and just all kinds of things, astrology, astronomy, all that kind of stuff, but mainly the intuitive oracle. You can find me live right here on Gemma Jade on Wednesday nights. The information will be in the description box. On Spaced Out Radio, Saturday and Sundays, you'll find me there live doing the after hour show. Again, information in the description box. And I'm over on Paranormal Chop Shop. Most of the time, I'm trying to get back over there. There's been a scheduling issue with me, but go on over there and subscribe anyway. Chad Smith Podcast, UFO Garage, Oracles and Beyond, Spaghetti Lee. I mean, I can go on and on. Trippy Times with Josh Casey. Gypsy Road. These are all channels that I absolutely support and love. But again, check me out here on Wednesday nights doing a 1-card pull, intuitive oracle reading, first come, first serve basis. The link to one of the live streams will be in the description box. If you feel like you want to check that out, come on in. Everybody is welcome. Also, like I said, Saturday and Sunday nights, check out Spaced Out Radio, okay? You'll find in the description box as well a way to purchase my book, Kindle or paperback edition, on Amazon. I'll leave the links. If you want a signed copy, hit me up before you make the purchase. Also, ways to donate to the channel: PayPal, Cash App, Patreon, and Amazon wish list gift link. Thank you guys so much for all of your incredible donations, your birthday wishes, just your general and overall support of me. I love you guys and appreciate you so, so, so much. Be kind to each other. Be kind to yourself. And don't accept anything less than others being kind to you. Kindness is free, okay? It doesn't cost anything to be a decent human being. Always go in grace, smile at a stranger, and I'll see you next time. Bye.